Thanks very much indeed for staying with us. So an international coalition of human rights law groups, public health experts and civil society organizations are all taking action against the US, the UK, Germany, Norway and Switzerland. And this is for violating human rights laws, they say. The coalition says the rollout of COVID-19 vaccines is taking place in an inequitable and racially discriminatory way. It says that the situation is a textbook example of structural racial discrimination. I beg your pardon. So joining us now to distill this intervention is Tim Hodgson, who is the legal advisor on economic, social and cultural rights for the International Commission of Jurists. And Tim, thanks very much indeed for making time to chat to us. Really do appreciate it. Let me start off by just asking plainly, do you imagine anything coming out of this? And I ask it in a context where, according to some people, even this legal action, noble as it appears, feels a bit elusive, because for one, who do you charge?
So the complaint is not made by the International Commission of Jurists, but it's made by a wide range of international organizations who advocate for the protection of international rights. And it's made to the committee, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And this committee is empowered through a treaty which is signed by most states in the world, including South Africa. South Africa's got a very good reason to have signed it, because it's one of the first treaties that very explicitly put against structural racial discrimination, including apartheid. The complaint is against countries such as Germany, Norway, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America. And it's pointedly so because of the unequal access to vaccines between the global north and the global south, and particularly these countries that have the presence disproportionately of pharmaceutical companies. And it's very hard to escape that vaccine access, if you look at the map of the world, very clearly maps itself onto more access where, by and large, there are whiter people in countries that performed and subjugated other peoples all around the world to colonialism, and less common in countries like our own country and continents like our own continent in Africa, where black and brown people continue to live all around the world. The committee has a mandate to ensure that structural discrimination doesn't occur, including in access to health care. And we hope that the committee will take this seriously, and this will put pressure on countries at the WTO later this month to enact the TRIPS waiver.
Yeah, even if things do go in favor of this coalition of various organizations, it doesn't solve the immediate problems, right? And that's to do with the fact that, structurally speaking, supply chains have disproportionately seen to it that about what? Of the 73% of all vaccines administered, those vaccines go to about 10 countries. In other words, it almost feels like we're going to need time anyway to try and ensure that these vaccines get to the areas that need them most.
So the problem is structural and systemic, and it is common in the global health environment. We've experienced similar things before. People in South Africa will recall with the HIV pandemic. We carry higher disease burdens in the global south and have less access to medication. And pharmaceutical companies are allowed to profit, and they're allowed to profit by their host countries, and they're allowed to profit by countries in the global north, because these companies allow for access to those who can pay and perpetrate a form of what some call medical neocolonialism, which basically means that we get sicker and others get the medicine.
Sure. Help us understand what the response ought to be then from these different countries, at least the immediate response. I mean, for instance, the US has come under fire for not having any meaningful reform in how their pharmaceutical companies respond to this challenge. Instead, Joe Biden has just decided to just keep donating to the countries mostly in the global south. So if donations aren't the right way to solve this problem, which needs to be solved urgently, what does the right path look like?
Yeah, so there was some hope in the start of this COVAX mechanism, but ultimately the COVAX mechanism has turned out to be a charity model-based affair. And it's the same type of thing where, you get the idea that the global north thinks that what its role is to do is to donate some of its overflow supply to the global south and then receive great thanks for that. But in reality, there's an obligation in international human rights law for cooperation between states to realize all rights, including the right to health for all people everywhere in the world. Now, immediately, there's an option in front of countries. South Africa and India made a proposal to the World Trade Organization last year, over a year ago, to waive intellectual property rights on all vaccines and therapeutics needed to treat and combat COVID-19. This would allow for the share of know-how and the sharing of information that would allow us to produce and disseminate vaccines and other therapeutics all around the world. Despite this, these countries that the complaint is against, and the countries that we continue as global civil society, including civil society in South Africa, to lobby against, are combating this waiver of intellectual property rights at the World Trade Organization without very good evidence. Now, the International Commission of Jurists has recently released an expert legal opinion that's been endorsed by more than 120 jurists from around the world that says that there's a human rights obligation on all states to not block this TRIPS waiver. And this complaint to the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination makes the same case, only it emphasizes the aspect which I said before, which is that there is this discrimination. A second point is that there is a lack of belief that it's possible for global south countries to, for example, produce and manufacture our own vaccines and our own medicines. If we are given the ability, the know-how, the technology, and the permission to do so, there is no reason to believe that in the long term we will be able to take care of our own populations and make sure that this situation doesn't repeat itself in the future. But right now, what we really need immediately is for the support for a TRIPS waiver, and later in the month, the member states of the World Trade Organization will be meeting, and it's inexcusable that many of the countries that perpetrated colonialism are now continuing to support things which deprive us of access to medication vital for us staying alive in the global south.
Of course, the well-rehearsed argument, Tim, is that allowing what you're calling for to happen would be, in some respects, anti-competitive behavior. In other words, it would take away an incentive for scientists to continue being innovative and to continue working as hard as they do, supposedly, in the global north. Your response to that?
Well, the evidence is against that kind of response for a number of reasons. But the first reason is that states are massively and have massively subsidized the research that went into the development of these vaccines. Years and years and years of research which were not done by pharmaceutical companies from all over the world, from academics and scholars and scientists went into this, and companies are profiting off of that. But in addition to that, even if it does reduce slightly the profits of pharmaceutical companies, which by the way have increased substantially since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the question is what we're going to prioritize, is profits or continued death and illness in countries where people can't access life-saving treatments. Should we not be dealing with how to compensate, if we were going to compensate, which I don't think we should, pharmaceutical companies, should we not think about compensating them after we've already disseminated the life-saving medication that is necessary right now?
Absolutely. And I guess part of what also needs to be considered is ways through which, in the meantime, countries in the global north can also capacitate themselves to be able to respond to this. I mean, there's something a bit bleak, for lack of a better term, isn't it? That so much of our ability in the global north to fight off a global health crisis relies so heavily on developments that have taken place largely in the global north.
Yeah, there is something bad about that, and that is about the system, and this is really the focus of the complaint from the organizations, is that the system is a system which is created as a continuation of colonialism and is a continued effect of failure to repair the harms done, and that is why it is racially discriminatory. And so this is true, and we need to look at reforming the system. We need to rethink how we think about intellectual property rights on healthcare services and on life-saving vaccines and medications. There's another simultaneous process underway which is being pushed by the global north, which is the development of a pandemic treaty, and that will be discussed at the World Health Assembly later in November. And you would hope that countries in the global north, but the precedent is not strong with this TRIPS waiver, would try and resolve this problem for future events by agreeing that in future pandemics, with future epidemic diseases that spread, that we will have a better way to resolve this, and we will have better and more effective and more equitable sharing of vaccines. Because if the impact continues to be on poor people who are brown and black and who are not white all around the world, the question that everybody will continue to ask is, are our lives worth less in places where we are not former colonial powers?
Absolutely. Do we have case law for how legal action like this is typically treated, especially when you consider that Big Pharma is involved so intricately in something like this? And I imagine they're going to throw all their money against this legal action because, of course,
of
their own interests?
So the legal action is obviously at a UN treaty body, and there's a lot of precedent for legal actions like this and others at UN treaty bodies like the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The focus at these treaty bodies is still primarily on state obligations. But there is an area that's developing in international law about the responsibility, the human rights responsibilities of corporations, and especially multinational corporations. Because the truth is that sometimes very big companies have power to influence states, and sometimes more power than particular states in particular arenas. And we definitely do need to start looking at in international law and in South Africa, placing further human rights obligations on companies. If you're a company like, let's say, a medical insurance company or a private hospital company or a private laboratory charging exorbitant fees in South Africa for COVID-19 tests, should you not, as a requirement to be selling us healthcare, be required to follow human rights standards, which include affordable and equitable access to medication? And I would argue yes.
Plenty to think about. Thanks very much for distilling it all for us as we watch these moving parts continue to move. Tim Hodgson is legal advisor on economic, social and cultural rights for the International Commission of Jurists. Once again, Tim, thanks very much indeed.